Ronnie. Eldridge, welcome to Eldridge and Company. I imagine that the idea of a new baseball stadium or an entertainment complex will fortify a city economically and emotionally. That idea causes Roberta Brandes Gratz great consternation. She has far different views, and I can't wait to hear them. Welcome.
Good to be here.
I think I should also say that you're an urban critic of great renown, and a lecturer, and an author of 2 classic books. And they are, the one is The Living City, Thinking Small in a Big Way, and the other is this book, Cities Back from the Edge, A New Life for Downtown. You live in the city, and you love the city, right?
I do, I do.
What a wonderful, great big laboratory it is for you, because I'm sure there are examples of everything in it that you can...
Well, that's exactly true, but also I tell people I did time as a teenager in the suburbs.
Oh.
And that shaped my, or I should say intensified my appreciation for the city. But the experience of both really sharpened the love of and interest in the city.
Where did you live? In Westchester?
Well,
I mean, did you live in a very suburban
Well,
community?
It was Westport, Connecticut, Weston, Connecticut.
Oh,
and
so you couldn't really walk to
Oh,
the downtown.
no. It was,
Yeah.
this was country. This is 1950s, you know. This was real suburb. Even Westport, which is now, very sophisticated downtown, this was real suburbs. But I had been raised in Washington Square Park and Washington Square South, and fled back when I could in the middle of college.
So when did you start really looking around and writing about it? You wrote about it in the Post.
When I started at
the
New York Post, I was a general assignment reporter for the longest time, but I was being sent all over the city, and it was very exciting, and I was coming up with some of my own stories, because out there, if you are, all it takes is being an observer. It's all about observation and listening to people. And I was covering stories of, people trying to save their neighborhood landmark or get a light installed in front of a school, or all the kind of things that bring people active in their community.
But it takes a bit of courage also, because it's always when you're really, it seems to me, especially in the city, it's a struggle. Most often, you're facing people that other people think really know what they're doing.
Oh, absolutely.
Do you know what I mean?
And over the years, it's very interesting to have watched the sophistication of the public, because years and years ago, people would say, "But I don't really know anything about this," and I'd say, "But of course you do. You live here. You know more than the experts." And this is something planners and city officials and all the so-called high-paid consultants never fully appreciated, and that is that the people who live and work in a locality really do know, A, more about what's going on, B, what the real problems are, not the imposed agendas or the imposed plans. So the clash comes in those 2 value systems. And in the cases where you have responsive city officials who know how to really listen and care, then things can work.
They listen, but go a step further and try to incorporate what you're saying.
But most of the time, there's an agenda that's already set.
Yeah.
And that's where the fight, because the compromise, the opportunity for compromise is very difficult. And a pet peeve of mine is this whole idea of NIMBY, not in my backyard, because most cases, I'm not saying all, but in most cases, it's not that people are against change. They're against the form of the change that is being imposed on them. Not that they aren't for improvements in their neighborhood. They can tell you what is needed. But usually the agenda is not about what is really...
And it's imposed.
It's being imposed.
That's the worst. You were a great friend of Jane Jacobs.
Absolutely.
How did you meet her?
Well, it's interesting. I'm not one of those people who had an aha moment when I read Death and Life of Great American Cities. And in many ways, I sort of came to a lot of similar thinking just by being 15 years as a reporter walking the streets of the city. But when I signed the contract for my first book, The Living City, it was with an editor, Jason Epstein, who was her editor. And we signed the contract in '78, and he said, well, now you have to go to Toronto and meet Jane Jacobs.
So she had already left the city.
She had left the city in '68. And I said, well, that's fine. And that's when I seriously read Death and Life and Economy of Cities. And I met her, and there was this extraordinarily warm, giving personality. And she took me all over Toronto and showed me different lessons, some of which I incorporated in the first book, Living City. But more than that, she nourished my thinking and challenged me. She said, well, Roberta, you can't think that way, or you should know, but often really was very encouraging. And the great thing about Jane was that you would ask her a question and she'd turn it around and say, well, what do you think? Because she was the ultimate observer and listener. And I learned some of that from her.
That's very interesting. She'd just come back and incorporate it.
Because she always said, and she said it in the first page of Death and Life, that the examples are all around you. There were no pictures in that first book, and that you should get out and walk. And that was basically her message. And it's a message that where people do that, they come to their own intuitive.
So what makes a livable city?
Well, that's a very big issue. I've already written 2 books, and I've got a third one on the way.
And you've traveled all across the country and the world, basically, right? So you've observed a lot of cities, and you see some that are alive and some that have lost out to suburbs, or what?
Well, it's really about process. The city and respecting the organic nature of cities. They're not planned. I mean, there are certain, planned places and everything, but cities are created by a multitude of people doing many different things at different times. They're not developed as one by one plan. There's a certain natural change that occurs according to who the people are and what is happening. And the cities in this country that didn't screw it up and mow it all down a la Robert Moses are the ones in the best shape today that are regenerating. And in this city, the neighborhoods that are the most successful, the most rejuvenated, the most long-term successful are the ones that Moses never touched. And the ones in the most trouble are the ones that he did. So it's 2, philosophies of how you deal with a city. One, you respect the organic nature of the city. You learn how to work with it. You don't preserve it in aspects, so to speak. There's always room for infills and change, but it's not, you don't take a whole block and make a whole new building. You work with the fabric. You replace pieces, and if you look at a traditional neighborhood, you walk down a street, and if you've looked at as many I have, you will know when that building was built, you will know what era it was built, you will know what it was built for, and a lot of these buildings go through many different cycles. They get used for many different things, but that's when they were built in this kind of organic form.
And you are on the Landmarks Preservation Commission. That doesn't mean, though, that everything should be static, as you said.
And the funny thing is, at the Landmarks Commission on a weekly basis, we are approving all sorts of changes to landmark buildings. And I like to point to Soho and Tribeca. If you look today, we have some of the Starchitect new buildings in those historic districts.
What do you mean by that?
Well, big name architects.
You mean the architects?
The stars.
The star. I thought you said start.
No, stars, the new word, Starchitect. But the point is, there's been a lot of change. Soho is a robust neighborhood, as is Tribeca and all of Lower Manhattan. It's not that the buildings are so dramatically changed, it's what happens in them that has changed. But there are new buildings, there are transformed buildings, there are add-ons, there are restorations. It's the whole mix, and that's organically genuine.
For people who are young and not watching this, it used to be a manufacturing district.
It was a vibrant manufacturing district.
Wasn't it, basically?
Everything.
Everything.
From trimmings to hats to everything. And it was declared a slum by the late, great Robert Moses because he wanted the expressway across town. But as I show in this book, in fact, I have the most important chapter, I believe, in this book is what I call the Soho syndrome. And it's the story of how Soho really emerged out of that fight and how it was still very much a vibrant neighborhood that became a slum because of its plan as an expressway. But it is the pattern that then went clear across the country. And once Soho became the norm in all the magazines, and every city in the country now has a Soho. Lodo in Denver, or Suhu in south of Huron, or Soto south of the Dome. I mean, everybody, but it's a process of the regeneration.
We even have North now. I mean, we have
and Nodo and NoHo and everything else. And then everything.
So what's an example of a city or a neighborhood? Well, let's look at the neighborhoods that failed in the city first. Where was that? Where he built these large...
yeah, well, I mean...
Cross Bronx Expressway?
Sure. Cross Bronx Expressway is a great example. And the thing is that everybody looks at the Cross Bronx Expressway as the best example because in Bob Caro's book, The Power Broker, that's the one neighborhood, that's the one story he tells with some wonderful interviews with the people who actually live there. So you really had a sense of what that neighborhood was like. But if you take that concept and you go around the city, the Gowanus Parkway, the BQE, they all these cleared out neighborhoods that were vibrant, that were called slums, and that undid a lot of the city. And
the West Side, I mean, all these urban renewal areas.
Oh, absolutely. And in the past 30 years, since actually close to 40, very organically, a lot of these neighborhoods have been coming back on their own, with developers coming in after the groundwork is laid. They're never the first ones in. You know, the citizens are the first. They go in, they either buy brownstones or they buy, you know, loft buildings or whatever. They get the process going. They are the precursors, what I call, of regeneration. Then come the developers, and then they take all the credit.
And then come the retail,
and then comes the retail. And then it's all done with this whole false notion that they are
they're the kingmakers,
like
right?
you said, with the stadiums and the malls. They come with this idea that they are renewing a neighborhood. Chances are the neighborhood's already renewed. They are clearing land that shouldn't be cleared. And they're not fitting in. They're imposing, and often with a car-based attraction, not a pedestrian transit-based attraction. And in that regard, I like to say that, and this is the sad story of cities all across America, that a collection of visitor centers visitor activities do not make a city. And unfortunately, a lot of cities that are suffering have gone from one visitor attraction to another, from the stadium to the arena to the mall to the casino to whatever it is.
Detroit, isn't that a...
And in the process, you know,
everybody's moved out.
Well, they
took over the
demolished
homes.
them. And sure, Detroit, 3 stadiums, and for parking lots so that
so the people who come to the stadiums can park,
right.
Of course.
So a lot of the downtowns today have been planned and supported by people who don't live in the city anymore, usually in the suburbs. Yeah. So it's with an agenda for their visitation, what they interpret is appropriate for the city, as opposed to what people who live there.
There's a national political force, though, that's very different towards automobiles and highways instead of transportation systems that would make it much more accessible to everybody?
Well, in the book that I am completing this week, titled The Tale of Two Gothams, New York in the Shadow of Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs.
That's going to be something.
Next March. I think it will be interesting.
Has to be interesting.
The point that I make an interesting point, I think, that the 20th century was the century of the automobile. The 21st century will be the century of transit. And all over this country now, elevated highways are coming down, transit that we destroyed. Every community in this country over a population of 2,500 had streetcars.
I used to take the streetcar to high school up Broadway.
Of course. And in fact, you know, New Yorkers don't realize
they're still there.
We have less of a transit system today than we did when Robert Moses started, because he eliminated all the streetcars and the elevators and promised the Second Avenue subway in return, of which we, you know, someday may get. But the point is that a lot of the undoing of that automobile, highway-centric thinking is happening, and of course, as we speak.
The automobile industry
and a lot of city people are learning how to do without their car.
Right.
Now, that's not going to eliminate the car, and this sends people into a tizzy. It's eliminating the dependence on the car. Yeah. That's the point.
So that if you want to go to the store, you don't have to get into the car and go.
That's the rule of thumb.
I have two daughters, each of whom lives in the suburb, but they're so determined that they live within walking distance of the stores, because otherwise it becomes a whole...
The early suburbs were built along train routes.
Right.
And then in the city, there were early streetcar suburbs were built along the streetcar. And the rule of thumb was within 15-minute walk. And the retail congregated along the stop, and then you walked home.
Right.
So
you have a wonderful thing, little pictures about the entrance to a train station or a trolley station or bus station, how they become a center in a small community.
Totally.
And they should be attractive.
And in a lot of towns and cities fortunate enough to still have them, as we had Grand Central, which some of us might remember was once not in the condition it is today and not thought of as having any value. These have become centers and places where in some places they've even had a dry cleaner and a small food store, the kind of things where you can, you know, pick up or drop off on your way.
Did you read the story the other day about Shanghai getting ready for the Olympics? What do you think when a city makes an appeal, goes to all this trouble for the Olympics?
Well,
what does that do to a community?
It's interesting. It's a mixed blessing, very mixed blessing, because a lot of stuff gets cleaned up and eliminated that shouldn't be.
Right.
And then some good stuff happens because the agenda is now for the outsider, not for the insider, and the insider just happens to benefit. But it's often a mixed bag, and the Olympics are not the great white hope. No, and the Olympics.
None of these big things are.
None of them are, and in fact, a friend of mine who was the planning director in Salt Lake City when the Olympics came once pointed out to me all the things that they bring with them, so that even the jobs that are promised and the businesses that are promised all come in from outside. So, and that's the least of it.
Right.
But none of these big projects are the generators that they promise to be, and they're all big public expenditures.
One of the other things, when we had this great migration to the suburbs, it always seemed to me that's a lonely existence, living in a house all by, you know, a family all by itself around. And I always thought that they gravitated to the malls because that was the urban center for them.
Well, it was the only one at that in a lot of places. But
and
I think
interesting that they had the instinct or something
to go to the center. People want to be with people.
Right.
And that's
activity.
And that's why streets and plazas are so important in cities. Absolutely. But and malls, you have to remember, shopping centers, which started when they were just one strip, were imitations of city streets. The mall developers learned what they did from city streets. But we also have to remember it wasn't just a migration. It was a push. There were a lot of things happening in the city that pushed people out. I tell some of that in my first book because it happened to my family, and I recount it in the book that's coming out next March because it's partial memoir. There was a pull to the suburbs. We were pushed, but all the federal financing went to the suburbs for the roads, the houses, and you couldn't get the same kind of financing in the city if you wanted to purchase a home. There was a lot of redlining. There was all kinds of things going on in the city that made it very difficult to stay.
Yeah. So where do you think we're going to go in the future? You think it's going to be very hopeful and helpful?
I think it's very clear in that people are moving or staying in much more pedestrian-oriented places. And the places that still have the fabric are learning to appreciate it and restore it, not in a classic museum way, but in a functional way. And the key, and I learned this from Jane Jacobs, the key to curing a place or helping it get better is to figure out what is missing and add it back, not try to redevelop or develop something new. If the streets have been widened for a highway, put it back, tame the traffic, widen the sidewalks, put back the trees, put back the furniture, break up some of the storefronts, allow residents to live on the upper floors. All these things were undone.
And so now we're going to bring them all back. What happens, though, as neighborhoods get revitalized, as people protect their neighborhoods and everything else, and that move from a neighborhood gets too expensive for somebody, so they move to the next, and eventually the people at the end have to move out?
There are a lot of ways to do it. My own feeling is that most officials really don't want to, because there are ways that government can help. There are a lot of ways to help people stay. I think there is a certain number, or you're gonna have some displacement in any movement. The thing about displacement in that upgrading cycle, the unslumming phase, as Jane used to call it, is that it's gentle, it's incremental, and sometimes people can move around in the same neighborhood. It's not cataclysmic in the sense of wiping out a whole place. So with Soho, as Soho got expensive, you had a lot of people who bought, sold well, took their money, went elsewhere, or lost out if they were renters. I mean, renters lose the most, and moved to the next frontier. And this happens.
And as they move to the frontier, it does the same thing.
But usually they move into neighborhoods that are already underoccupied. So the first phase is usually filling a lot of vacant spaces. And then, there are lots of different mechanisms, and I've written about some of them in both of my books, that can, in small incremental ways, help people stay.
Are we successful when we try to always provide affordable housing in a community?
We're not very successful.
Thing?
We're not very successful because we really don't do it very well, in the sense that we don't
isolate.
First of all, we don't protect what we've got. So we've lost more over the years than we've gained. And then we tag it on to these huge, out-of-scale new developments. And then the affordability standard is very deceptive, because affordable then becomes a higher level just by the nature of the economics of that neighborhood. It's not affordable necessarily to the people who are being displaced. It may be affordable to a higher level of low middle income people moving in. It's a very tricky process. And the ones that really do it the best are much more community-based development groups they have in the past than large-scale kind of things.
So do you think now with a community organizer as our president?
Yes.
I think that's an important sense, isn't it?
Well, it certainly is. And one of the things that was sort of flying around the internet that got us all excited was a case during the campaign where someone in the audience out in Ohio held up a book and said, "Mr. Obama, I want you to have this book. It's a very important book about how we should regenerate our cities." And he said, "Is it Jane Jacobs?" And oh my God, we said, well, you know, at least he understands. The forces against this are monumental,
enormous.
but he starts from a place of understanding the grassroots.
Now, we didn't talk about your
the Center for the Living City.
And it's got its website.
It's Center for the Living City, and there are two things: Center for the Living City, and what we call Jane's Walk USA, which we do every year to celebrate her birthday, where we get a totally self-organized way. People sign on to give walking tours of their own neighborhood to show what they see, to help observe the characteristics of a neighborhood, and bringing people together. And this is the second year we've done it, and it's growing in leaps and bounds.
So we'll tell everybody again. We'll put the websites on the screen. But you also have a website.
I do. RobertaBrandesGratz.com.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Roberta, and I hope that people will read and pay attention and really get the confidence to know that what they think is right in their neighborhood is most likely right.
Their intuition is probably the best.
Thank you.
If there are any people you'd like to hear and topics you'd like us to explore, please let me know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.